The wind carried a faint scent of autumn through the quiet pine forest, a crisp fragrance that hinted at change. Deputy Ethan Cole adjusted the strap on his patrol vest. His canine partner Shadow, trotting a few steps ahead, paws barely making a sound. On the leaf-strewn path. It was supposed to be a routine afternoon, the kind you almost forget the next day, until Shadow froze mid-step. Muscles taut, gaze locked on a stand of tangled maples no hiker ever dared cross. Moments later, Ethan would find a small figure hidden beneath the leaves. And his life, along with the little girl's, would never be the same. Some bonds are forged in moments, and they can change the rest of your story. Share where you're watching from, so we know where our circle of loyalty begins. Cedar Hollow State Park in northern Maine had a rhythm Deputy Ethan Cole had come to trust. The same winding trails, the same creeks chattering over smooth stones, the same squirrels chiding him from the same stumps. It wasn't the kind of assignment that made headlines, but it gave him breathing space-time to think, time to work in peace with Shadow, his 4-year-old German shepherd whose amber eyes missed nothing. That October afternoon, sunlight filtered in golden shards through a thinning canopy, speckling the dirt path with patches of fire orange and pale yellow. The air was so crisp it felt new with every breath. Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who sniffed casually at a heap of leaves. "Not a bad gig, boy?" He murmured. Then Shadow stopped. Not a lazy pause. This was a hard, statue-still halt, ears forward, tail lowered in controlled focus. Ethan had worked with him long enough to know the difference between curiosity and certainty. The dog's head tilted toward a dense thicket 50 feet off trail. No human footprints led that way. Ethan's voice dropped low. "What is it?" Shadow didn't so much as glance back. He moved purposeful, quiet, threading between saplings, nose to the ground. Ethan followed, boots crunching over damp leaves, until the forest seemed to muffle itself around them. And then he saw her, a child, 7 years old, maybe younger. She was curled against the base of an old oak, half hidden beneath moss and leaves, as if the forest itself had tried to keep her secret. Her hair, dark and tangled, was damp from the cool air, and her oversized jacket swallowed her narrow shoulders. Dirt smudged her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't move. Ethan's knees hit the ground. Hey, sweetheart." He checked quickly. No bleeding, no obvious trauma, but her skin was pale, almost gray. She let out a faint breath, and for a moment, her gaze drifted past him to Shadow. Her lips moved in the faintest smile before her eyes closed again. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, Cole here. I've got an unconscious juvenile female. Approximately 7, half a mile in from Cedar Hollow's north entrance. Request immediate EMSA." The confirmation crackled back. Ethan shrugged off his patrol jacket and wrapped it around her small frame. Shadow sat close, his flank pressed against her leg like an unspoken vow. "You're going to be all right," Ethan said softly. "Help's on the way." Minutes later, the forest stirred with the sound of EMTs moving in. They knelt beside Ethan, working with quiet efficiency. "She's underweight," one murmured to her partner. That word dug deep into Ethan's gut. The girl had no ID, no backpack, nothing. Just a name she whispered at the hospital, Sophie. By the time the ambulance pulled away, Ethan knew this wasn't just a case of a lost child. Kids didn't end up alone, hidden in the woods. Unless something was very wrong. At Cedar Hollow General Hospital, pediatrician Dr. Allison Keene examined Sophie. She was stable but weak, with signs of malnutrition and lingering abdominal pain. Social worker Grace Monroe tried gently to draw Sophie out, but the girl kept her answers to herself, gaze always sliding toward the window. Back at the station, Ethan searched for missing child reports. Nothing matched her description, not in Cedar Hollow, not in surrounding counties. That fact alone told him what his instincts already knew. This wasn't the middle of a story. It was the beginning. As the October sun sank behind the hills, Ethan drove past the hospital. For just a heartbeat, he thought he saw a small figure framed in the window, watching. He made himself a silent promise that whatever Sophie had been running from, she wasn't going back to it. The morning air over Cedar Hollow State Park carried a thin silver mist, clinging low to the ground as if the forest was holding its secrets close. Deputy Ethan Cole tightened his grip on Shadow's leash. He hadn't been able to sleep. Every detail of yesterday's discovery kept playing on a loop. Sophie's pale face, her whispered name, the way Shadow hadn't left her side. They returned to the North Trail just after sunrise. The path was quiet except for the soft snap of twigs under Ethan's boots. "All right, partner," he murmured. "Let's see what we missed." Shadow moved ahead, nose sweeping low in deliberate arcs. At the stand of maples, he stopped abruptly, head turning toward a mound of damp leaves off the path. He pawed once, then twice. Something purple peeked through. Ethan crouched, brushing the leaves. Aside, a small backpack lay half buried in the dirt, fabric damp, zipper half stuck. He pulled on gloves before opening it. Inside were a crumpled second-grade math worksheet with Sophie Marlowe written in uneven letters at the top, a faded school lunch card from Cedar Hollow Elementary, and a worn photo of Sophie sitting on a porch beside a young woman in a plain t-shirt, arm wrapped protectively around her. "Good work, boy," Ethan said, slipping the items into an evidence bag. Shadow wagged his tail once before resuming his quiet watch. By mid-morning, Ethan stood in the main office of Cedar Hollow Elementary. The school secretary, Mrs. Howell, handed over Sophie's file with a worried look. "She's missed a lot of days this month, 8, maybe more. Her emergency contact is her mother, Marianne Marlowe, lives about 10 minutes from here. But, officer, things at home might be complicated." The address led to an aging apartment block with peeling paint and a rusted swing set out front. No answer at Unit 2B. A neighbor, Mrs. Duncan, peeked out from the next door. When Ethan showed her the photo, her expression softened. "Sweet kid, plays alone a lot, too thin. I see her on the swing sometimes after school, just sitting. Haven't seen her mom since yesterday morning. She works long hours cleaning houses, I think." Back at the hospital, Sophie sat up, in bed coloring quietly. Grace Monroe pulled up a chair beside her. "Those are pretty," she said gently. Sophie only shrugged. "Do you like school?" Another shrug. "What's your favorite thing to do at home?" The crayon paused. "Draw," Sophie murmured. Grace smiled. "Like now." A tiny nod. Later that evening, Daphne returned to the hospital to find Marianne Marlowe standing by the bed, still in her housekeeping uniform, hair pulled back in a loose bun. The reunion was fierce but quiet. Marianne cupped Sophie's face in both hands, whispering in a trembling voice before pulling her into a long hug. Love was there, raw and real, but so was something else in Marianne's eyes. Fear. Dr. Keene explained Sophie's condition: malnourished, low iron, stomach inflammation, issues that had been building for months. With proper nutrition and care, she'd recover. Marianne listened, eyes lowered, hands twisting together. When Grace asked how Sophie ended up in the woods, Marianne hesitated. "I was working. I thought she was at school. When I came home, she was gone." Her voice trembled on the last word. In the parking lot afterward, Ethan leaned against his truck, staring at the darkening sky. The story didn't fit. If Marianne thought Sophie was at school, why hadn't anyone called when she wasn't? And how had the girl ended up nearly half a mile into the park without a soul noticing? Something in his gut told him this wasn't just about one child's bad luck. This was the beginning of a thread that, once pulled, might unravel more than he expected. Shadow nudged his hand, and Ethan gave a faint smile. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "This isn't over." Morning laid a gray veil over Cedar Hollow. The kind of light that softened edges and made the town look like it was holding its breath. Deputy Ethan Cole parked beside the worn playground at Pinneview Apartments, the place Mrs. Duncan had pointed him toward. A swing moved lazily on its own, squeaking in the breeze. Shadow's ears flicked once, then settled, the dog's gaze sweeping the courtyard like a quiet sentinel. An elderly man in coveralls maintenance, by the look of the key ring on his belt, was replacing a cracked porch bulb. "You Tony?" Ethan asked. The man glanced down, then at Shadow, something like relief crossing his face. "Morales," he said. "You're the one with the shepherd that found that little girl." Ethan nodded. "Sophie," Tony exhaled. "Kid's a ghost around here. You see her, then you don't. I brought her crackers sometimes when she sat on the steps. After school. Ate them slow like she was making them last." He hesitated, eyes drifting to the swing. "Should have called someone I know. Where I grew up, calls to authorities don't always end well for families just trying to hold it together." Ethan heard it again, the same rough-edged truth wrapped in fear, and wrote it down anyway. Shadow nosed the air, then set his chin on Ethan's thigh, a steadying weight. From Pinneview, Ethan crossed to Cedar Hollow Elementary. Fluorescents hummed in the main office as Mrs. Howell handed him a thin folder and gestured to room 104. Ms. Pierce, early 50s, hair pulled into a no-nonsense twist, looked up from a stack of spelling quizzes when he stepped in. Her face shifted when he said Sophie's name. A careful, practiced composure gave way to a tired kind of worry. "I kept notes," she said, pulling a manila file from her drawer. Inside, dates and small observations told their own story. Fatigue. In class, repeated absences, a hand pressed to a tender belly, the same sweatshirt worn 3 days in a row. "I took this to our counselor," she added, lower now, twice. In the counselor's office, Mr. Wilcox folded his hands neatly on the desk and said the word Ethan had started to hate, monitoring. "We try not to overreact," Wilcox explained. "Escalating can fracture families." "So can waiting," Ethan said, too quickly. Shadow's tail gave a single soft thump, the only sound in the pause that followed dot by noon. Ethan's notebook was crowded with careful versions of the same confession. Amber at the grocery remembered Sophie staring at apples like they were something sacred and out of reach. A bus driver recalled small waves through a fogged window, the kind of goodbye a child gives when she doesn't know if anyone is watching. A neighbor 2 floors up swore she heard a soft cry on a recent evening, then told herself it was the TV. Alone, each detail was nothing. Together, they were a map of a town that had seen and softened and stepped back. Ethan drove to Cedar Hollow General with the weight of that map in his chest. Room 312 was quiet when he eased the door open. Sophie sat propped against pillows, drawing in a small spiral notebook. The gel pens he'd brought yesterday, bright little comets, were scattered across the blanket. Shadow lowered himself to the floor with a sigh, chin on paws, eyes on Sophie. Grace Monroe looked up from the chair by the window and gave Ethan a small nod, then slipped out to make a call. "What's your got?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. Sophie angled the page. A house with a slanted roof, a skinny tree out front, a figure on the steps, knees tucked to chest. "Is that your place?" he asked. She shrugged, the smallest lift of her shoulder. He sat, letting the quiet do the work for a while. "You know," he said eventually, "Shadow's favorite thing is finding what folks think is lost." Sophie's pencil paused. "Mine too," she said, so soft he almost missed it. "What are you trying to find?" Another pause. "The middle," she whispered. "Everyone keeps asking for the beginning and the end. The middle is the hard part." When Marianne returned from a meeting with billing, she looked older than she had that morning. Dr. Allison Keene arrived moments later with printouts, iron levels up a notch, inflammation starting to respond. "She needs consistent meals and follow-ups, Allison said gently. We'll line up a clinic, vouchers, whatever it takes. Marianne nodded, eyes shining with gratitude and dread in equal measure. When Grace rejoined them, she asked if they could talk privately. In the family lounge, Marianne gripped a styrofoam cup like a lifeline. I have 3 jobs, she said, the words tumbling out. Morning houses, evenings offices. On weekends a restaurant after close. My neighbor used to watch Sophie. Then she got sick. I tell Sophie school, then home, lock the door, wait for me. Some days I call. Some days I can't. She stared at the coffee. I went to the clinic. They said wait. I went to the AIA. They said if it's not an emergency, it will cost thousands. I'm not a bad mother. No one's saying that, Grace said softly. But we have to know. How she ended up in the park. Marianne's eyes flicked toward the door. I told you. I came home and she was gone. She swallowed. I looked everywhere. I thought if I call, they take her. Ethan kept his voice even. Did anyone come by? Anyone new around the building? Marianne shook her head, a beat too long, something guarded shuddering behind. Her eyes. No, she said. No one. Back in 312, Sophie had drawn something new. A cluster of trees, a wide trunk, a small figure curled at the base. And at the edge a dark shape, taller than the trees, just a smudge of graphite. Ethan pointed gently. What's that? Sophie's jaw tightened. Shadow? She shook her head. He's the sun. Ethan smiled despite himself. Then who's this? She traced the smudge with the tip of her pen, almost erasing. It. A shadow that's not shadow, she said finally. From before, the room felt smaller, air thinner. Ethan kept his voice soft. Before the woods? She nodded, eyes dropping to the blanket. Did someone tell you to go there? Silence stretched and stretched. Sophie's fingers went to the band of her hospital bracelet, turning it. Sometimes, she said at last, people tell you secrets because they don't want you to tell anyone else. She looked up then, and he saw the courage it took. If I say the secret, will you make trouble? If it keeps you safe. Ethan said, steady as a heartbeat, we'll make the right kind of trouble. He left the room with a promise to come back after dinner and found Grace in the hallway. She's protecting someone, he said. Grace nodded, jaw set. And Marianne's protecting something. Through the glass, Shadow lay unmoving, watchful, as Sophie drew a small circle of stick figures holding hands herself at the center. The dog beside her, a woman with a clipboard, a figure in a badge. It's harder to get lost in a circle. She had told him yesterday. He held on to that. Outside, dusk gathered over Cedar Hollow, streetlights flickering to life one by one. Ethan stood with the weight of the town's quiet on his shoulders and felt Shadow press against his leg. A wordless "you're not alone." Somewhere between a mother's fear and a child's silence was the middle, the hard part Sophie had named. He'd find it, pull the thread, and let the truth unravel in the light. And if that truth meant knocking on doors people preferred to keep shut, then so be it. Some trouble was worth making. The next morning, a brittle frost silvered the grass. Outside Cedar Hollow General, and the sky had that pale, icy blue that made sound carry farther than usual. Deputy Ethan Cole cradled a paper cup of burnt coffee in one hand, while Shadow sat at his heel, gaze locked on the hospital doors. The shepherd was restless today, more alert, more deliberate, as if he knew the pieces were beginning to shift. Ethan's plan was simple. Start small, start close. If Sophie wouldn't yet fill in the middle of her story, maybe the neighborhood would. The Pinneview Apartments complex was quieter than it had been yesterday, but Mrs. Duncan was out sweeping her stoop. She eyed him over the broom bristles. Back again? Just tying up loose ends, Ethan said. Ever notice anyone spending time with Sophie? Not family, someone else? Mrs. Duncan frowned. Sometimes a man in a brown jacket. Stood by the playground fence, hands in his pockets. I figured maybe a relative, but he never came inside. Sophie would glance at him, not wave, just look. She leaned closer. Didn't like the feel of it. Ethan's pulse ticked up. When did you last see him? She thought. Maybe a week before she went missing, in the evening, dusk. From there, Ethan walked a short block to the corner store where Amber, the cashier, remembered Sophie. She was with her mom once, Amber said, but another time she came in alone. No money, just looking at the candy. I asked if she needed help, and she shook her head and left. Kind of quick. Amber glanced toward the cooler. There's a security camera goes back a month. By mid-morning, Ethan was hunched in the store's cramped back office, watching grainy footage. There was Sophie, small and slight, her hair half tucked behind her ear. She drifted past the candy aisle, glanced toward the front windows, and froze. A tall man in a brown jacket stood outside, leaning against the brick wall. He wasn't watching the street, he was watching her. Sophie's eyes darted away, and she slipped out the side door. Gone from view in seconds, Ethan copied the clip to a thumb drive, thanked Amber, and stepped back into the cold. The pattern was taking shape. Someone had been near Sophie more than once, and she wasn't reacting like he was a stranger. By afternoon, Ethan was at the hospital again. Room 312 smelled faintly of crayons and the citrus hand sanitizer Dr. Keene used religiously. Sophie was at her desk by the window, the spiral notebook open, gel pens scattered. Shadow patted over, laying his head in her lap. She scratched his ear absently while finishing a drawing. "What you got today?" Ethan asked, pulling up a chair. She turned the page toward him. A park, trees like tall green triangles, a winding path, and tucked to the side, a bench. On it, she'd drawn herself, knees pulled up, and beside her, a taller figure in brown. No face, just an outline. "Who's that?" Ethan asked softly. Sophie's pen hovered over the page. "Sometimes," she said after a long pause, "people say they're friends." "Is he a friend?" Her eyes lifted to his solemn, "Not mine." Ethan kept his voice even. "Did he tell you to go to the park?" She shook her head, but not in denial, more like she was shaking away words she didn't want to say yet. Shadow pressed closer against her, and her hand found the thick fur at his neck. "He said there was something I should see. That Mama would want me to see it. What was it?" Ethan asked. Sophie's grip tightened on Shadow. "I didn't see. I got scared, then you came." Later, in the hallway, Ethan relayed it to Grace Monroe. "Brown jacket bench, told her to go to the park. Could be grooming, could be luring." Grace's expression hardened. "And Marianne hasn't mentioned anyone like that." "Not once," Ethan said. "Either she doesn't know, or she knows too much." By evening, Ethan was back at his desk, reviewing the footage from the store again. Freezing frames, noting posture, height, the way the man kept his right hand in his pocket. No local records matched. But the way Sophie's voice had gone small when she said "not mine," that was enough to keep Ethan from leaving it alone. Shadow lay stretched across the office floor, tail thumping once when Ethan looked his way. "We've got him now, partner," Ethan murmured. "Just have to pull the rest of the thread." Outside, night rolled over Cedar Hollow, the street lamps casting long shadows on the frost-white sidewalks. Somewhere, the man in the brown jacket might think he'd vanished back into the quiet, but Ethan knew better. Shadow never forgot a scent, and Ethan never forgot a promise, especially one made to a child who'd learned too young that not all friends are safe. Tomorrow, they'd start finding him. And when they did, Ethan intended to hear the middle of Sophie's story straight, from the man who thought he could keep it hidden. The next day broke with a thin layer of ice on the ways, patrol car's windshield, and a sharp wind that cut through Ethan Cole's jacket. Shadow leapt into the back seat, settling with that calm focus Ethan had come to rely on when things started to sharpen. Today was about finding the man in the brown jacket. No more slow circles. Ethan began at the Pinneview Apartments again, showing a still frame from the store's security footage to anyone who'd open their door. Most shook their heads. A few said the face was too blurry. But at the far end of the complex, a lanky teen in a hoodie paused longer than most. "Yeah, I've seen him," the kid said. "He hangs around the bus stop on Harris Street. Doesn't take the bus, just waits, like he's looking for someone." Harris Street was a narrow run of cracked sidewalks and leaning telephone poles. The bus stop shelter stood in front of an empty lot where weeds had claimed the chain-link fence. Ethan parked down the block, Shadow beside him in the passenger seat now, head resting on the console, eyes fixed forward. They waited. Midday traffic was light, the bus schedule infrequent. 2 buses came and went without incident. Then on the third, Ethan spotted him. The same posture, the same brown jacket zipped to the collar, hands deep in the pockets. He stood at the far end of the shelter, scanning each passenger as they stepped off. Ethan's pulse slowed into that deliberate beat he'd learned in the Army: stay measured, stay quiet. He stepped out of the car, badge clipped to his belt. Shadow moving in perfect sync at his side. "Morning," Ethan called as he approached. The man's eyes flicked up, cool and flat. "Something I can help you with?" "Actually," Ethan said, "I was about to ask you the same thing." "You spend a lot of time around Harris Street?" The man shrugged. "Waiting for a friend." Ethan tilted his head. "A little girl?" "About 7. Seen her at the park?" For the briefest moment, the man's jaw twitched a tell Ethan knew well. "Don't know what you're talking about," the man said. Shadow stepped forward, tail low, body angled, that steady stare trained on the man like a silent interrogation. The man's gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan. "You got a problem, take it somewhere else." He turned, walking toward the alley behind the lot. Ethan didn't follow immediately. He'd learned the value of not spooking the subject before you had something solid. Instead, he circled back to the car, watching in the rearview as the man cut through the alley and out of sight. Shadow whined once, low. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I don't like it either." Back at the station, Ethan ran every variation of the man's description through county records: height, build, possible age, nothing. But when he widened the net to state databases, a name surfaced. Calvin Royce, trespassing charge from 3 years ago, loitering near a school bus stop 2 towns over, dismissed due to insufficient evidence. By late afternoon, Ethan was back at the hospital. Sophie was drawing again, this time a bus stop shelter, its roof sagging a little in her lines. A small stick figure herself stood on one side, and on the other, the tall figure in brown. "Was this the same day you went to the park?" Ethan asked. She nodded once. "He said my mama needed me to go there, said she was waiting." Her pen slowed, but she wasn't. Grace Monroe, standing just inside the doorway, caught Ethan's eye. They both knew what this meant. Sophie hadn't wandered. She'd been sent, or rather, lured. When Marianne arrived that evening, Ethan stayed in the hall, letting Grace take the lead. Through the glass, he saw Sophie glance toward the doorway more than once, as if checking whether the dog and his handler were still close by. Later, in the parking lot, Ethan leaned on the hood of his truck, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. Shadow sat beside him, scanning the shadows that stretched across the asphalt. "We've got a name, we've got a face," Ethan said quietly. "Now we need proof." Because in Cedar Hollow, proof was the only thing that could push past the hesitation, the fear, the polite silence that had let Sophie vanish into the trees. And Ethan had no intention of letting Calvin Royce slip back into them. Not while Shadow's nose could still find a trail. Tomorrow, they'd start closing the gap. The next morning, a wet fog settled over Cedar Hollow, muffling sound and turning the streetlights into pale halos. Deputy Ethan Cole sipped bitter coffee. In his truck outside Cedar Hollow Elementary, Shadow sitting in the back seat with his nose pressed to the barely cracked window. Today wasn't about luck, it was about watching, learning, and waiting. Grace Monroe had arranged for Sophie to stay in the hospital another day, buying Ethan time to see if Calvin Royce would circle near the school. Sophie's teacher, Ms. Pierce, had agreed to keep an eye out from her classroom window and call if she spotted anyone loitering. Just before the morning bell, Ethan's phone buzzed. Dark jacket. Bus stop bench across from the playground. Miss Pierce's text read. Ethan's pulse steadied into focus. He spotted him easily. Royce. Brown jacket zipped high. Same slouched posture. Same scanning gaze that seemed to measure every kid stepping onto the blacktop. But today was different. Today Ethan had backup. Officer Mark Rivers was parked 2 blocks over, ready to intercept if Royce moved. Ethan stayed still, letting the fog and the truck's shadow cover him. Shadow sat motionless in the back, his amber eyes locked on the man outside. When a group of kids passed, Royce leaned forward, his gaze snagging on a girl in a red coat. He didn't move toward her, but the lean was enough predatory, deliberate. Ethan clicked the mic clip to his vest. Mark, hold position. Let's see where he goes. For the next 20 minutes, Royce didn't sit still. He'd pace a few steps, stop, scan. Once, he pulled a phone from his pocket, pretended to check it, then slipped it away without unlocking it. A classic loiter tactic: look busy, stay invisible. Finally, when the playground cleared, Royce turned and headed down Oakley Avenue. Ethan gave it a beat, then pulled out, keeping 2 car lengths back. Royce walked like a man with no fixed place to be, meandering past the hardware store, cutting through the lot behind Peterson's Diner, then disappearing into the narrow alley that ran between Main Street and the freight tracks. By the time Ethan swung around to catch the far end, Royce was gone. Back at the station, Ethan spread what they had on the table: footage from the corner store, Royce's record, Ms. Pierce's text, his own observations. It was enough for suspicion, but nowhere near probable cause. Royce was careful. Too careful. That afternoon, Ethan visited the hospital. Sophie was curled in bed, gel pens scattered like bright confetti around her notebook. Today's drawing was of the school windows, playground, bus stop, and Royce was there again. A tall brown figure in the corner. Did you see him before? Ethan asked, pointing to the drawing. She nodded, slow. At the swings, at the store. Near the steps at home. Ethan leaned forward. Did he ever talk to you before the park? Her crayon paused mid-line. He asked my name once. Said my mama told him to walk me home. She met Ethan's gaze, eyes wide and steady. Mama didn't. Grace, standing by the wall, caught her breath. It was the clearest piece yet, the first direct link tying Royce to Sophie's disappearance. When Ethan walked Marianne into the hallway afterward, her face was pale. You think he's after her? I think, Ethan said evenly. He's already tried. That night, Ethan and Mark Rivers mapped Royce's known haunts: Harris Street bus stop, Oakley Avenue, the corner store, Pinneview Apartments. They marked Sophie's routes: school to home, home to store, store to playground. Too much overlap to be coincidence. Ethan closed his notebook. Tomorrow, we bait the hook. Mark glanced at him. You thinking a decoy? Yeah, Ethan said. Plainclothes officer at the bus stop, same time Sophie would normally be there. Royce won't know the difference until he's too close. Shadow lifted his head from under the desk, ears pricking at the tone in Ethan's voice. Ethan reached down, scratching behind the shepherd's ear. You ready to finish what you started, partner? Shadow's tail thumped once, quiet, steady, certain. Tomorrow, they wouldn't just watch Calvin Royce. They'd give him the one thing he couldn't seem to resist, the illusion of opportunity. And when he took it, they'd be there. A brittle wind swept down Oakley Avenue the next morning, cutting through the early sun and making the bus stop shelter groan softly where its metal frame met the cracked concrete. Deputy Ethan Cole sat in an unmarked sedan half a block away, his eyes fixed on the reflection in his side mirror. Shadow was in the back seat, head just high enough to see out the glass, every muscle still. Across from the playground, Officer Danny Willis stood in place of a child. Her red coat and knit hat could have passed for a parent's quick choice on a cold morning, but she was no child 5'4", trained and ready. A pair of earbuds connected to a concealed mic let her speak without moving her lips. Decoy in position, she murmured. "Copy," Ethan replied, his voice low. The street was quiet except for the rumble of the first school bus pulling away. 15 minutes passed. Then, like a shadow bleeding out of the alley, Calvin Royce appeared. Same brown jacket, same slow, deliberate gait. He didn't go straight to the bus stop, he circled, pretending to check the timetable posted on the shelter's side, pretending to be anywhere but exactly where he meant to be. Ethan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "He's here." Royce moved closer to Donnie, stopping just outside arm's reach. He said something too low for Ethan to hear over the wind, but Danny's mic picked it up. "Your mom sent me. She's waiting for you. Wants me to walk you." Danny's voice was calm, practiced. "What's her name?" Royce hesitated a fraction too long. "She said you'd know." That was enough. "Move," Ethan said into the mic. The sedan door swung open, boots hitting pavement. Royce's head snapped up as Ethan closed the distance in 5 measured strides. Shadow was at his side, the leash taut but controlled. "Calvin Royce," Ethan said, voice sharp. "Cedar Hollow PD. Keep your hands where I can see them." Royce took a step back, eyes darting between Ethan and the dog. "What's this about?" "You've been talking to children who aren't yours," Ethan replied. "One of them ended up in the park last week. You want to tell me how that happened?" "I don't know any kids," Royce said, jaw tightening. Shadow let out a low, steady growl, the kind that carried warning in every vibration. Royce froze. Donnie stepped out from the shelter, her badge now visible on a chain around her neck. "We've got witnesses and footage, Royce. You're done." Royce's mouth twisted, but he didn't resist when Ethan guided him toward the car. Still, there was no confession, no crack in his flat-eyed stare. At the station, Royce lawyered. Up before the booking officer finished reading his rights. By afternoon, Ethan was back at the hospital. Sophie was sitting cross-legged in bed, shadow curled like a sentry at her feet. When Ethan came in, she looked up from her notebook. "You found him," she said, not asked, but stated, like she'd known it would happen. Ethan nodded. "He's not going to bother you again." Her eyes flicked to Shadow. He'd never get past him. "Not a chance," Ethan said. Grace Monroe stepped in a moment later, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Child Protective Services has cleared Sophie to go home with her mother," she said carefully. "But Mary Ann will have a caseworker and regular check-ins. And there's a community aid fund covering groceries and medical care for the next 6 months." Mary Ann's relief was visible, but so was the wariness. She took Sophie's hand, brushing hair from her face. "We're okay now," she whispered. Though Ethan knew it would take time before either of them truly believed that. As they left, Sophie turned back. "Deputy Cole?" "Yeah?" She pointed at the notebook in her lap. "I drew a new circle." He walked over. This one was bigger, more stick figures. Mary Ann, Grace, Dr. Keene, Danny, Mark Rivers, and Ethan himself. And right at her side, Shadow. "It's harder to get lost in a circle," she said again, her voice stronger this time. Ethan smiled, the kind that reached all the way into his chest. "That's the point, kiddo." That night, Cedar Hollow's streets were quiet under a thin frost. Ethan walked Shadow along the North Trail, the shepherd's breath puffing white in the air. They passed the stand of maples where everything had begun, where a little girl had been waiting for anyone to see her. "You saw her first," Ethan murmured. Shadow glanced up, amber eyes bright in the dark. And as the wind stirred through the branches, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. There'd be no more invisible children on his watch. Not here, not while Shadow's paws still touched. These trails. Winter crept in slowly over Cedar Hollow, frosting rooftops in pale white and filling the air with wood smoke from chimneys along Oakley Avenue. It had been 3 weeks since Calvin Royce was taken into custody, and though the case was still winding its way through the system, his absence was felt like a window finally shut against a cold draft. Deputy Ethan Cole sat in his truck outside Pinneview Apartments, watching the small playground sway under a crisp December wind. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, head high, ears forward. The swing that had once carried Sophie alone for hours now held 2 girls, their coats zipped to their chins, laughing as they spun the chains. Mrs. Duncan stepped outside with a paper bag of birdseed. She caught Ethan's eye and walked over. "Feels different now," she said. "Like we're all looking a little harder." She nodded toward the girls. "We're making sure no one's alone out here anymore." It was the same at Cedar Hollow Elementary. Miss Pierce had started an after-school art club, a place for kids to stay until parents could pick them up. The counselor, Mr. Wilcox, had a new policy. Any unexplained absences were called in by noon. No exceptions. The old hesitation had thinned, replaced by something sturdier. Action. Ethan visited the hospital less often now. Sophie had been home for 2 weeks. Today, he knocked on Marianne Marlowe's apartment door and was greeted by the smell of warm bread and the sight of Sophie darting down the hall to hug Shadow. "He still remembers," she grinned, burying her face in his fur. Marianne stood in the doorway, tired but softer around the eyes. "We're making it," she said. "The caseworker checks in every Tuesday. Sophie's eating better, sleeping better." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't know how much I'd been carrying. Until it wasn't all on me anymore." Grace Monroe joined them inside, arms full of art supplies for Sophie's drawing corner. "The community fund came through," she said. "Groceries for 3 months, bus vouchers, and a volunteer from the church who can help after school." Sophie was already flipping through her spiral notebook, showing Ethan the latest pages, less gray, more color. One was a forest scene, the oak tree still there, but now Shadow stood in front of it, tail wagging, a wall between her and the dark shape that had once haunted the edge. "That's how I see him now," she explained. "He's in front and I'm behind, safe." Ethan's throat tightened, but he only said, "That's exactly where he belongs." Later that week, Ethan and Shadow walked the North Trail again. Frost crunched under his boots, the sound echoing in the stillness. They stopped at the spot where Sophie had been found. It looked ordinary now, just leaves, moss, and an old oak, but Ethan knew better. This was where a quiet town had been forced to see what it had chosen not to for too long. He thought about the people who'd noticed something was wrong: Mrs. Duncan, Tony Morales, Amber at the store, Miss Pierce, and how fear had kept them still. But fear, he knew, was lighter when carried together. At the next town meeting, Ethan stood with Grace before a packed community hall. They spoke about the gaps, about the moments when a call could make the difference, about how silence can grow heavier than action. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, calm and steady, his very presence an argument for loyalty and courage. Afterward, Mrs. Duncan came up to Ethan. "We didn't act before," she said. "We will now." She squeezed his hand. "All of us." On his way home that night, Ethan drove past Marianne's building. Sophie was at the window, her face lit by the warm glow inside. She saw the truck, lifted her hand, and waved, not the tentative kind of wave he'd seen in the past, but a bright, certain one. Ethan slowed, returned the wave, and felt the smallest knot in his chest loosen. In Cedar Hollow, a circle had been drawn: neighbors, teachers, friends, all linked together, and inside that circle was a little girl who was no longer invisible. Shadow shifted beside him, his tail thumping once against the seat. "Yeah, partner," Ethan said quietly. "We did all right." The frost on the road caught the headlights like scattered stars, and as they drove into the winter night, the quiet of Cedar Hollow felt different, not like a place holding its breath, but like a place finally breathing again.